Hello everyone, it's Kamini here from Long Game Health. Welcome back to yet another week on the channel. Today I am back with a nutrition-based topic because there's been a surge definitely in recent years about focusing on eating natural or real foods, things that aren't processed. So on the more extreme end of this, you have people making their own bread, growing their own fruits and vegetables, maybe having some chickens in the backyard that lay eggs for them. And all of that is great. I'm not here to say that's a bad thing because I do believe that a lot of the issues with health that come from our modern ways of eating are from the amount of processing that we do to foods. But I think there is also an issue with saying all processed foods are bad because it's just not realistic for a lot of people to completely remove processed foods. So today, I actually wanted to do a video focusing on processed and ultra-processed foods. I'll be talking about the difference between these two, what kind of foods you will find under these categories, what they can do to your health, and I will point out some processed foods that aren't so bad for our health too. So let's just get right into it. Now, food processing is actually a spectrum. There are levels to how much a food can be processed. But understanding this is actually a key part of making informed decisions about what you eat. So on a basic level, we have processed foods and ultra-processed foods. But what many people ignore is that processed foods have three different levels to them. We have minimal processing, moderate processing, and high processing. So let's just dive into these a bit more. Minimally processed foods are foods that have either no processing at all or processing done to them purely with the goal of preserving them and extending their shelf life so they last a little longer before spoiling. But the goal is also to maintain the natural integrity of the food as much as possible. So some examples of minimal processing includes freezing fruits and vegetables so that you can buy frozen bags in the supermarket, washed and cut salads that are pre-packaged for you, and also pasteurizing milk, which is basically just when milk is heated to very high temperatures to get rid of bacteria. And this makes the milk last longer. And we also have whole grains like brown rice and oatmeal. Frozen meats come under this too, but only the ones without any added ingredients or breading. Here is a bit of a list, and from these examples, none of this actually seems to be that bad for your health. In fact, these are all foods that I would recommend people try to increase in their diets for some positive health benefits. And yet, technically, some people would label them as processed, thinking they are somehow not good for you. When people talk about having a diet that is mainly whole foods, it's this category that they are talking about. So the next level of processing is moderate processing, and with this category, additional ingredients are added to foods and more techniques are used to process the food to create entirely new food products. But the goal is still to have some resemblance to the original foods used. So, for example, canned vegetables falls into this category, as well as baked bread, cheese, and yogurts. Pre-cooked chicken breasts, canned salmon or tuna inside oil, and also ground meat fall under this category. Again, here's a bit of a list for you. A lot of the foods in this category are processed for the sake of convenience, to make it easier for us buying the foods to prepare them at home. And still, these are not foods I would tell people to remove from their diets, but they are technically processed. So now we move to the highly processed foods, and I think when people talk about processed foods, they mean the highly processed foods, because this category involves pretty large changes to the food's original forms. Ingredients like sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats usually get added to enhance the flavor, texture, and of course make the food as convenient as possible, usually ready to eat. Here is where we have the pre-cooked meals, ready to eat cereals, frozen pizzas, and all of the things like packaged cookies and cakes, potato chips. Again, here is a list of examples for you. Now, there is one final category, and that is of course the ultra-processed foods, and this category sits at the furthest end of the spectrum as you can be. This is all the foods that are created pretty much entirely from additives and industrial ingredients, so man-made ingredients. All the other categories at least started with a real food and changed it in some way. This category just throws real food out the window. They are made for sensory appeal, for convenience, and to have a long shelf life, and this is all done at the expense of nutrition, because they pretty much have zero nutritional value. They are nutritionally void, as I like to call them. So examples of these are instant noodles, candy and chocolate bars, sodas, and yes, energy drinks, sugary cereals like this, breakfast bars. Here are a few more examples for you. This is definitely the type of processed food that you want to minimize in your diet. I'm still not saying don't have any of this, but you don't want to be having these on a daily basis. These are special treats if you want them ideally. So what I am trying to point out by going through the different levels of processing is that processing of food isn't inherently bad, and the minimally and moderately processed foods are quite important to having a well-balanced diet. But the level of processing has a huge impact on nutritional content of food. And as we move into the highly and ultra-processed foods, that's where things get a bit negative for your health. So let's actually look into the impacts they may have on health. There are specific nutrient issues that we need to be worried about when it comes to mainly the ultra-processed foods, but also some of those highly processed foods as well. But for now, I'm focusing a bit more on the ultra-processed foods, because if there is just one change you can make, it should be to reduce these in your diet. So issue number 1, high sugar. By now, we know that high sugar intake increases your risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. Ultra-processed foods are a huge contributor to sugar intake, and a lot of these food products have sugar contents that are way above the recommended limits. And the sugar that they contain are the simple sugars, the ones I have mentioned in previous videos that spike your blood sugar. These are the sugars we want less of in our diets. Now, cereals are a good example of this. Let's look at a family favorite, the Frosted Flakes or the Frosties. These have 12 grams of sugar per serve. And based on the Australian Dietary Guidelines, anything that has over 15 grams of sugar per 100 grams is considered high and maybe something to try and reduce or avoid. These have 43.4 grams of sugar per 100 grams. Issue number 2, unhealthy fats. I've done a video in the past that goes through the different types of fats that are found in foods. Click here to go see that one. But in that video, I mentioned that it is saturated and trans fats that are the problem fats because they can raise cholesterol levels, which increases the risk of heart disease. So, another example, instant noodles are an ultra-processed food. Let's look at a classic, the Indomie instant noodles, and we have 11.2 grams of saturated fat per serve. The recommendation is that a maximum of 10% of your daily calories should come from saturated fats, but we want this as low as it can be. And again, the Australian Dietary Guidelines suggest avoiding foods that have anything higher than 3 grams per 100 gram, and these have 6.4 grams per 100 gram, so not ideal at all, sadly. I do enjoy having these once in a while, I won't lie. Now, next up is sodium. This is a huge issue with ultra-processed foods, and high sodium or salt intake from your diet increases your risk of high blood pressure, which can lead to heart disease later on. Processed meats and instant noodles usually are high in salt, but let's look at the old pre-made frozen pizza. We have 478 milligrams per slice, and I don't know anyone that has just one slice when eating these. But when it comes to sodium or salt, anything less than 400 milligrams per 100 grams is good. Ideally, you want less than this. But this is actually 350 milligrams per 100 grams, so technically not terrible. But then you look at the saturated fat being 5.9 grams per 100 gram, and you can see not ideal. Now, the final issue with ultra-processed and even highly processed foods is the lack of fiber. Fiber is hugely important for gut health, digestion, and even blood sugar control. Because of the processing methods involved in ultra-processed and highly processed foods, fiber tends to get stripped away and removed. Now, a good example of this is white bread. Grains are usually a really good source of fiber, but when they get processed, the fiber is removed. Now, we can see here, white bread has less fiber than the whole grain. So the whole grain being less processed has more fiber, and I will be doing a video soon about how and why fiber is so important, so make sure you subscribe because you definitely don't want to miss that video. And on top of these examples that I have just gone through, there is plenty of research that has found that those on a high ultra-processed food diet have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, depression, irritable bowel syndrome. More and more we are finding that these heavily processed foods are not having good impacts on our health. There is plenty of research on this. And I'm not trying to say avoid everything and never have these foods ever again. It's all moderation. And all you can do is try to make some small changes slowly. Reduce these highly processed and ultra processed foods while increasing the foods that are minimally processed. Make changes that you can sustain for the longer term so that you can compound the benefits later on in your life. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of the spectrum of processed foods and how not all processed foods are bad. If you can, have a look at the labels of what you are consuming and then just try to make changes where you can. Do they have too much sugar? Do they have too much saturated fat? Try and find an alternative for yourself. But if you have any more questions, please just comment below. If you learned something or just enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. I put out a new video every Friday to help educate you about health in some way. See you next week, and until then, keep playing the long game.